there, and welcome to this episode of SelfKind with me, Erica Webb. It is episode 263, which is wild, and we are going to be talking all about boundaries for the highly sensitive person. I am continuing to answer questions that have come through over on Instagram, and this was one that I thought really deserved a full episode, possibly even more down the track. But the question that came through was, how do you deal with boundaries and speaking up for yourself as a highly sensitive person? So we're going to touch on a few things in this episode. One, why setting boundaries and speaking up as a HSP can feel so hard. Two, why as a HSP you actually have some superpowers when it comes to setting boundaries that maybe you're not seeing through that lens just yet, but I promise are there. And number three, a few key things to consider when it comes to actually exercising your boundaries. What can that look like? What do you want to be mindful of? And how can we start to get curious and practice this in some maybe kind of small ways? So why is setting boundaries and speaking up for ourselves so damn hard as a HSP? Here's the thing. As a highly sensitive person, you are very likely highly aware of other people's emotions, and not only aware of them, but impacted by them. And so when we have that awareness and impact from somebody else's feelings, it's very easy to confuse that with being responsible for them. And I think that happens when we're quite young. We sense, this is how mum feels, or this is how dad feels, or this is how friend feels. And we kind of recognize that we have some power or some ability to manipulate how that person feels. And I don't mean that in a manipulative way, right? When I use the word manipulate, I don't mean that we're like these little 5-year-olds being like, I'm going to manipulate their emotions. But we have this sense that, what I do seems to have an effect on what this person does and how this person feels, because I can sense that, I can feel it, I can pick up on the clues about what's going on. And so I think as HSPs, we learn quite young the impact that we can have on other people, and we mistakenly believe that it's our role to do that, right? To kind of keep the peace, to have things run smoothly. When I was young, I would absolutely have described myself as the peacekeeper. That was the role that I played. That doesn't mean that I didn't have tantrums and, slam my door when I was a teenager and do all of those things. But on the whole, I would have considered myself a peacekeeper. I knew when to keep my mouth shut. I knew when to say certain things. And more often than not, that had to do with controlling or changing the energy in a room rather than speaking up for what I believed in. And I think that this happens to a lot of us highly sensitive people because we know how to play that game. And when we're young, it's a game of love and survival, because that's how we sort of can sometimes find our place in a big, confusing, scary world. So that's part of it, right? What have we learned as kids? What have we learned that we have to do in order to keep the peace, keep people happy with us, feel loved, feel included? This is true for all the people everywhere, not just highly sensitive people, but I think the impact on highly sensitive people can be more pronounced. Then we have the reality that as grown people, there is the chance that our high sensitivity kind of works in our relationships. It might be that some people that we are in relationship with actually really benefit from our high sensitivity because, again, we know how to diffuse conflict. We know what not to say, what to say. But that can mean that we're not always exercising our kind of authentic desires or setting boundaries that feel really nurturing to us because we're kind of more concerned with just keeping things on an even keel to keep ourselves feeling a little more regulated. And that's the risk, because I think what can happen is as we get older and we realize, there's parts of me that perhaps aren't being expressed or aren't being heard, that can start to lead to resentment, feeling frustrated, feeling unseen. And so we want to be able to embrace the superpowers of these sensitive traits, but not discard ourselves in the process. And so that's why I think this conversation is really important. And so my point there being that if in our relationships, our sensitivity kind of works to the advantage of the relationship and perhaps to that other individual. And this could be any kind of relationship, right? It could be a parent-child relationship. It could be a romantic relationship. It could be a friendship. It could be a colleague relationship, boss relationship. It can be tricky to start changing those dynamics by starting to put boundaries in place, by starting to speak up when maybe we wouldn't have before. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't and can't do it. So, what are your superpowers when it comes to setting boundaries as a HSP? The thing that I think is a real superpower is the ability that you might have to sense physically what it is that's going on for you. So, there's a very good chance that if you feel heavily impacted by the emotions of other people around you, that you have access to, on some level, what that feels like, right? What do I feel when I feel impacted by another's emotions? And it might not be something that you can articulate. This is the thing with kind of somatic awareness, is that it's not always something that's super easy to articulate, but you can feel it. You can kind of hold that feeling state in mind. And so I think that often there's the tools there to notice, how do things impact how I feel? And how can I use that information then, when harnessed, well and correctly, to know when I'm perhaps not exercising a boundary that I would like to, when I have breached a boundary that was important to me, but I didn't, exercise. And where am I perhaps feeling limited because of my worries around how that's going to impact someone else? I really think that the clues for all of that live in our somatic experience. We can access them. And I think as a highly sensitive person, it's a bit of a superpower. So we're going to explore that a little bit more in a few minutes. What I want to say is like my number one tip around this. And actually, before I do that, what I want to say before I give you my number one tip is I want to say we are all human. This is no surprise. We are all humans and we are all navigating this on a daily basis. Whether you're highly sensitive, not highly sensitive, whether you feel really equipped with sort of your boundaries or you feel like this is just a complete new landscape. We are all humans navigating the best that we can. And like everything that we talk about on this podcast, it's never about becoming perfect at these things. It's never about, well, I'm either doing this well or I'm not doing it at all. It's always about, how can I just navigate this as a fallible human who is curious about simply staying curious as I continue to navigate, right? That sort of sounds like an incomplete sentence, but there is nothing to perfect here. There is nothing to kind of hang your hat on to say, well, I've nailed this now, or this is terrible. I'm absolutely awful at this. Can we allow the exploration of our boundaries to be simply that? Something that we can be curious about, something that we can explore, something that we can recognize. Sometimes we're going to feel like we're nailing, and sometimes we're going to feel like we're failing, and that is okay. So my number one tip is that as a HSP, as a highly sensitive person, just because you can sense how somebody else feels does not mean you are responsible for how that person feels. Even if you have evidence from the time you were a small child that says, but I can change that. I know how to do that, right? Just because you can sense, anticipate, and navigate somebody else's emotions does not mean that you are responsible for that person's emotions. However, because of what I said before, there may be relationships where that's been the dynamic, right? We have been kind of that role player for another person in our life. And so that might feel tricky to change, and that's okay. But at the end of the day, when we are dealing with other adults, we are not responsible for other people's emotions as long as we are being kind. Kind doesn't mean, though, always doing what somebody else wants. Kind doesn't mean not exercising our boundaries, not speaking up for ourselves. We can be very firm and kind at the same time. So, I say we're not responsible for other people's emotions, but if you're calling someone bad names, if you are being cruel to someone, then that is not okay. But you know that because I just don't think you're that kind of person. So when us HSPs are worried about hurting somebody else's feelings, it's usually not because we're being like assholes, right? Like it's because we are so aware of the fact that we can sense those small shifts in other people's feelings. So just because you can sense that doesn't mean you are responsible for it. And I think that once we start to really recognize that and start to play with that, we might even kind of exercise a new mantra that says, a reminder to myself, I am uncomfortable knowing that X person is disappointed, but I'm also not responsible for that. I can recognize my discomfort and I can recognize that I'm not responsible for that. So the new reminder might be, here's how I'm feeling and here's why I'm going to kind of stick to my boundary, because I also know that I am only responsible for my actions, not that person's. The thing that I find often is that highly sensitive people might feel more comfortable dealing with their own disappointment, dealing with their own sadness, dealing with their own dysregulation in their nervous system than the deep discomfort that can come with feeling like we have caused someone else's discomfort. And that level of responsibility that you're willing to take on, to say, I would rather hold my own disappointment and discomfort than kind of maybe do that to another person. We have to assume that other adults can also take responsibility for themselves in the same way. And so I think it's important to practice distinguishing between what is mine and what is somebody else's. What is mine and what is me empathizing with another's pain? And can I empathize and not always take action that is at odds with my boundaries? So I can empathize with your disappointment. I can empathize with your sadness without twisting myself into knots, doing something that discards my boundaries or breaches my boundaries in order to make you happy. There is a difference, but we have to start practicing and getting curious about, okay, well, what's mine and what is somebody else's? Now, when I say that, what I wonder if people hear, at least some of us hear, is the, almost like a lack of compassionate action. And I think they're very different things, right? So we can empathize with someone and feel compassion towards someone and then take action to support that person, kind action to support that person. Yes, great. We do this, right? But there's a difference between that and saying, let's give a really concrete example. Would you like to come out to a party tonight? No, I would not like to come to a party tonight. And you can sense that person's disappointment. Maybe they even tell you outright, oh, I really wanted you to be there. It's not going to be the same without you. No, right? And you can feel, oh, I've really disappointed them. Maybe I should just go. I don't really want to go, but maybe I should just go. I'd really rather stay home and watch a movie, but maybe I should, or I'm sick or whatever. In that moment, we don't necessarily need to take compassionate action and say, oh, well, I'll just do what you want me to do because I don't like that you're disappointed. We can say, hey, sorry, it's disappointing, but this is what I need tonight. And so we can empathize with that without then degrading our boundaries to satisfy that other person. So they're kind of different, right? I hope that makes sense. One of the things I think that we can do when we're thinking about distinguishing between what's mine and what's theirs is like tapping into that narrative that I just sort of said out loud. Noticing, am I responding to my own desire to go and I've just said no in a moment of fear? Or am I responding to the fact that they're just disappointed and I don't want to disappoint that person? So it's like checking in and asking, what am I actually feeling? Can I listen into that inner dialogue to get some clues about what might be going on? What does the feeling that's coming up actually have to say? if I just give it a little bit of space. Rather than having a knee-jerk reaction to, I'm uncomfortable, I've made this person disappointed, I better just say yes because that will make them happy. Very different thing. This is where I think it can be incredibly valuable to be regularly engaging in mindful movement practices. Somatic exercise is my favorite, but any kind of mindful movement practice would be beneficial because it helps us to connect with our physical boundaries. It helps us to connect with what we're feeling as we change the input into the body. So when we're doing mindful movement, and we might be doing, say, just something really simple like a shoulder circle, we notice that, as I move around this kind of physical boundary of that joint, here's how the sensations change depending on where I'm at in that movement. And so we can start to connect with, okay, well, here's my physical boundaries. Here's what I feel. Here's how what I feel changes based on input. And again, we don't have to have words to put with this necessarily, but we're present to what's happening in real time. And I think that skill to get curious about our capacity to sense what's going on in ourselves can then flow out when we're in these situations and wondering, what's mine, what's theirs? Because we're more skilled at and practiced at noticing, here's what I feel when it's mine. And whilst we might not be going through a huge emotional roller coaster while we are practicing these mindful movements, sometimes we might be, but the skills that we learn through movement, we can then also apply when we are in those more emotional states. And so again, it's, this word, if we counted how many times I'm going to say this word in this episode, it would be a high number, but this curiosity to be able to sort of use that and harness that to just notice, I wonder what that might be pointing me towards. What I think about mindful movement and what I think is important to note is that, sometimes when we talk about like, how do I do this, right? How do I exert my boundaries? How do I put my boundaries in place? We want a really quick, concrete answer. And like all good things, I don't think that there are always really good, concrete, quick answers. Sometimes there are, absolutely. I've had certain things said to me over the years that I'm like, that is something that I can put into action straight away that really makes a massive difference. When it comes to this movement piece, I think it's a slow burn. I think it's something that we kind of cultivate over a lifetime. And that's not a bad thing. That's really not a bad thing. Again, you're inviting yourself to get curious. You're inviting yourself to notice, how do I identify what's mine and what's not? How do I identify what's influenced by another and what's kind of bubbling up from me on my own? And how does that differ when I'm perhaps trying to manipulate or control somebody else's feelings? And when I'm doing that, is it more about me or is it about them? It's just this opportunity to put a big question mark in place of these more knee-jerk immediate reactions that we might otherwise have. And then this last one is one of my favorites, actually. This is something that I find myself doing literally daily. And that's to get really curious about what somatic clues pop up when you've either breached your boundaries or you're about to breach your own boundaries. What do you feel and where do you feel it? So a somatic clue is something that you feel in your body. All right, a somatic clue is something that you notice that causes you to pay attention. It's like a little alarm bell. Examples of this might be when you feel dread, when you feel resentment, when you feel a sense of heaviness in your gut or anxiety in your chest, feeling like you're pushing through wet concrete. What you're looking to do when we're getting curious about these sensations is to feel into and sense into your inner alarm system that says, you know what, you just ignored something that was important to you. And again, this is about being human in a human world. And so it's not about being perfect and never having those moments, but being able to go, oh, that's interesting. I said yes. And at the same time as saying yes, I felt a deep drop in the pit of my stomach. And I wonder what that could be pointing me towards. What if I get curious about that? Because that felt like a little pay attention signal from my body. So what am I not paying attention to? I have learned to listen really clearly to these signals, but it doesn't mean I always follow through on it, because sometimes I will feel the dread and I'll be like, no, I'm still saying yes, because we're human and we will do that. But we are absolutely so much better equipped to navigate our boundaries when we are curious about these signals, when we are willing to have a little moment with them and be like, okay, well, what might I be missing? And I think that, when we talked about what's your superpower as a HSP when it comes to setting boundaries, it's this. It's that ability to hear those little inner whisperings that say, maybe not. Or on the flip side, to notice, how do you feel when you really, it's a hell yes. How does it feel when you're really clear on an answer? And kind of adjacent to that, how does it feel when you're clear, but then fear starts to go, are you sure? Because these are all different things. We have the clear yes, we have the yes with fear that makes you start to doubt yourself, and we have, I said yes, but I really meant no. And I think that each of those has their own unique somatic markers. So we want to start to learn what they are. A final thought. Is it a final thought? I maybe have a couple of final thoughts. But when you're exercising your boundaries as a HSP or learning to speak up for yourself, especially in a relationship or in a dynamic perhaps where that hasn't been the norm, I think it's important to recognize that it will be hard, right? It's not like you hear this podcast episode and then you're like, this is going to be easy. I'll just say no and it will be fine and I won't feel anything and they won't feel anything. It probably will be hard. When we do something that is outside of that sort of safe zone, we feel like we know what the outcome will be. It is going to alarm our nervous system. It is going to register as a threat, right? Because if you have been used to sort of people pleasing and doing the thing that you know will get you the outcome that you want, or get the person that you're pleasing the outcome that they want, saying no will kind of raise a bit of a flag for the nervous system to say, we're about to do something that might upset someone. And what happens when someone's upset? We might get rejected. And what happens when we might get rejected? Then we're banished from, our pack, our community. That's not a good thing. That is a threat to our survival. So it makes sense that our nervous system is going to go, are you sure about this? And so it might try to stop you by bringing up the doubt, by reminding you, how easy it would be to just breach your own boundary in the preference of that person's desires. But I think that when we go into that dysregulation, when we go into that point where we're like, I can feel my nervous system having this impact, it's doing this thing to kind of, we're having this moment of fear. We're having this moment of like, are you sure this is safe? That's our opportunity to try a little something and prove to our nervous system that was okay. That went okay. And we might find that then our ability to do that increases a little. And so we wouldn't start with the hardest boundary. We wouldn't start with the really tricky thing. We wouldn't start with the thing that makes us feel like we're, about to melt into the earth with fear. But we might start with, no, I don't really feel like pasta tonight. Can we maybe not go to that restaurant? Or you know what I really would love? XYZ. Those things are, maybe slightly easier places to start than some of the bigger things. And so that would be my final tip, is to start with small, simple things if this feels hard. And remember, this really simple but not always easy thing to remember. I am responsible for my emotions and my actions, and you are responsible for yours. Even if I, as a highly sensitive person, know that I can influence how you feel based on what I choose to do, not do, say, not say. You may have to remind yourself of this over and over and over and over and over and over again, but it doesn't make it any less true. Just because you can sense somebody else's emotions, just because you have evidence over a lifetime that you can change how somebody else feels based on what you do, doesn't mean that you should violate your desires, boundaries, and wishes over and over again. I think that we can, really almost flip that too and be like, what a gift to be able to know too that saying a kind thing, smiling at someone, all of these beautiful things that we can do really can influence the way somebody else feels. And that's a beautiful gift as well. But look for the opportunities that don't require you to diminish who you are, or diminish what you want, or diminish your values, moving towards your values, which is what I think we're really talking about when we're talking about boundaries. Is the thing that you are doing or tempted to do in order to please another, in order to kind of influence how another person feels, is it moving you away from your values? Is it causing you to shed a part of yourself that's important to you? Is it causing you to bench a desire, want, or need that is important to you? Those are some of the filters that we can start to look through. I think that's it. I would love to know if that brings up any questions, or if if there's something specific from there that feels particularly helpful or supportive. I would love to know. Like I said at the beginning, I'm human. I am working on this stuff in real time too. And there are certainly, I think, for each of us, particular scenarios where this feels easier and particular scenarios where this feels harder. I certainly find it a lot easier now in my 40s than I did in my 20s and my 30s. And I imagine that will continue to be more and more true as I move further into my 40s. But I'll report back on that. So connect with me if you have questions, if you have other questions for the podcast. I would also love to hear from you. And until next week, keep being kind to yourselves, and I will talk to you really soon.